So I'm Sonalie Figueiras. Nice to see you again from this morning. Joining me today is a super panel of experts and change makers. Very, very quickly, I'm just going to introduce them before they all introduce themselves. So we have David Fechner. Hi. We have Edwin Bark, and we have Simon Jackson. Do you want to start?
Sure.
Intro?
First of all, thanks for having us here today. Simon Jackson, I work for a company called Compass Group Australia, so a food service provider servicing 6 different sectors in Australia, so resources, education, business and industry, defence, what else? We've got healthcare in there, and then also stadiums. So we've also brought our recent brand Levy into Australia, so moving into that more retail-focused stadium market.
Thank you, Simon. Edwin?
Good afternoon, Edwin Bark. I'm Senior Vice President at Redefine Meat. Redefine Meat is a company that was founded 6 years ago with the belief that technology and plant-based ingredients can be combined to create new meat the way we know it, without compromise, but also created with the conviction that we cannot give up the love of meat. So what we say is we love meat. We're not saying that people should stop eating meat, but actually trying to convince them that there's an evolution like there is with the iPhone. So the telephones are changing, meat is changing, and so new meat is a concept that we try to bring across, and which is something that sets us as a brand apart from most other brands. So we don't talk about vegan, vegetarian, plant-based, rather about new meat. What makes us unique is a proprietary technology, which is additive manufacturing, which is a technology we use for our whole cuts. Unfortunately, we couldn't have tasted today, but hopefully one day we will be able to bring it to the market.
Thank you, Edwin. And David?
Yes, so my name is David. Very excited to be here with all of you today. I'm a behavioral scientist at Griffith University up in Brisbane. And our research group looks broadly at how we can create a food service industry in which the tasty, affordable, convenient, and culturally appropriate choice is at the same time the environmentally sustainable and healthy choice. And we do this by tackling the problem from 2 sides. We started initially from the consumer side, so figuring out what are the main barriers that prevent consumers from ordering plant-based meat dishes and plant-based dishes more generally when dining out. And now we develop targeted interventions to overcome those barriers. But we also realized very quickly that we need to get the chefs on board. So we did a study on why chefs are hesitant to use plant-based meat dishes, and now a similar approach, work with chefs to see how we can entice them to offer those products.
Thank you, David. Before we get started on the panel with all these lovely gentlemen, I'm going to do a very quick keynote to kind of set the stage for a few things. I believe this was meant to be by someone from Food Frontier. Is there anyone? Otherwise, I'm going to skip through it and go to my slides. So we're here to talk about food service, and it's a very different discussion to talk about the role of alternative proteins in food service, because on the consumer side, and the retail side, you're really dealing with brand and that kind of building out brands, and you're selling to the end consumer in the grocery store essentially. Whereas food service, you're looking at chefs, you're looking at how to feed large amounts of people and to kind of influence their choices. And I wanted to present a couple of things around what we've learned covering this space a lot. About 2-3 years ago, we realized that food service was a huge lever for impact, and that one of the things that's interesting about the industry is a lot of the data that gets quoted around plant-based meat sales, especially in the United States and in Europe, tends to be around retail sales. And those do not encompass food service sales. And what we realized was that in food service, there was actually this very bright spot where there were things happening and food service was actually showing a lot of growth for plant-based. And we'll talk about why. So one thing I want to start with, and this is kind of general to the industry, but also just sustainability, is there tends to be quite a large, what we call sustainability say-do gap, where people say they want sustainable products, and that they're willing to pay, but then they're not buying them. And that tends to be, that's why surveys can be kind of misleading, because people will tell you, yeah, I really care about the climate, really do, and then it just doesn't translate to sales. And there's a real opportunity here to kind of use this information in a food service environment. People have become very different in their attitudes to food. We tend to think that people don't like change and that everyone's the same, but actually in the last 15 to 20 years, and especially in the last 10 years, with the rise of things like social media and travel, global travel becoming a lot more common, people have changed how they look at food. And today's food consumer tends to be 4 different things. One, they tend to, there's the foodie culture. So people know a lot more about food and food culture than they used to. There's a huge kind of and growing health conscious part. So people using food for nutrition and health, and kind of looking to foods as a way to, as a proxy for how to be healthier. They also tend to be more informed and demanding, which can be difficult sometimes if you run food establishments or brands, because they will speak out, they will be very vocal on how they feel. And then finally, despite all things, they continue to be very price and taste driven, and that tends to be what's important at the grocery store. But how do these things translate in a food service world? We'll look at that in a second. Another thing that is really important to think about and is going to have a huge impact on how food service operators think about what they put on the menu is Scope 3 emissions. So they are the emissions that basically are the greenhouse gas emissions that occur indirectly from a company's value chain. So up until now, a lot of reporting has focused on Scope 1 and 2, which are the direct emissions that companies are responsible for, but there's a lot more regulation, especially in Europe, but it will go to the rest of the world as well. It's already happening in California, for example, which is the 5th largest economy globally. And what it means is to do business in Europe or in California, if you're a company over a certain size, you need to report your Scope 3 emissions. And if you're a food company, most of those are down to basically, the Scope 3 emissions can make up to 90% of all your emissions. So they're the blind spot that a lot of companies have avoided for a long time, but they are also a lever that we can use, especially in the alternative protein space, to pull and to get food companies to change. And some of them are already doing this of their own volitions, because basically they need to report them, which means eventually they need to reduce them. And if you're a food service operator or a big food company, what is on your menu in a big cafeteria actually has a role to play in your Scope 3 emissions. And so that's why there's been a lot of work being done in how we can use what we call defaults, which is a form of behavioral science where you essentially change what is the obvious choice or the default choice, and have impact that way. So, for example, one big food group did a case study with the LinkedIn office in San Francisco, where they have a coffee bar for employees that's free. And they changed the milk to be Oatly. It was previously dairy. They changed it to Oatly. And then they just analyzed what happened over 2 weeks. And over 2 weeks, not one single employee asked for dairy milk. They just drank the oat milk. They didn't even think about it. And that had a huge impact on those 2 weeks, the emissions, the Scope 3 emissions of that food service company for those 2 weeks. And so these kind of trials and tests are being done all throughout the world in different scenarios. But essentially, there is a huge lever to pull in things like school cafeterias, hospitals, prisons, corporate cafeterias, anything that is involved in public procurement. And there's actually been a lot of studies done to push public money to be connected to Scope 3 emissions and to push them to choose plant-based options in public, basically eating scenarios that are paid for with public money. And so food service can really be an incredible lever and have huge impact, because the numbers in food service are massive. So instead of just convincing one consumer, you're getting a whole room sorted out by changing the default milk. And so food service operators are facing all these pressures, and we're going to hear from a little bit more about this, but essentially they really have to they really have to tackle supply chain adaptation with an ever worsening climate crisis. Ingredients are becoming harder to source. There are price fluctuations that are very, very difficult to plan for. And so that makes it very difficult to run a food service business, because ingredient costs is really a key part of how successful you are. There's also kind of a movement to be more inclusive. And so having plant-based menu defaults or having a lot of plant-based options also makes it easier for people with religious or allergy issues, right? You immediately are more inclusive and have options. And in many cases, and it's been covered in some of the previous talks, there's a cost reduction aspect too. One of the things that we look at a lot and do a lot of reporting on is what we call nudging, which has to do with, it's basically all around menu design research, and we're going to hear more about it. But essentially, there's many things you can do on menus and on presentation of foods and on naming of dishes when you're in a food service context that can change what the end consumer in that space actually chooses in a cafeteria or in a kind of group food setting. One example is something called, for example, hedonic labeling, where you name things in a really fun way. So a lot of people have been talking about how things are tough for plant-based meat in the US, and yet there's a chain called Slutty Vegan that is a burger chain with really outrageous names for their sandwiches. They work with Impossible Foods for their patties, and they're just doing super well. They keep opening new locations. Their sales are growing. They keep getting more funding. And it kind of almost goes against everything we think we know about how to approach naming. But people want to feel good. People like things that are fun. And the founder has really made a case for the value of this. I also want to talk about the power of naming. This is a case study from an NGO that I work with called Food for Climate League. And essentially, it looked at the difference of how to name bean dishes. And this was really interesting. When you named it, talking about the protein aspect, there was less of an uptake. But when there was a celebration of the beans' culinary history or gastronomy, there was a much bigger uptake. So this is an interesting thing. People respond to food culture and kind of exciting discovery of cuisines. And then finally, the same organization, Food for Climate Leagues, did this research with Sodexo, actually, and another organization called Greener by Default in the US. And they basically looked at what happens when you just basically make plant-based choices the default. And some of these plant-based choices were whole food plant-based with beans. Some of them were with alternative protein plant-based meats. And 58% of people chose the plant-based option without any other changes made. No kind of campaigning, no marketing, just positioning them in a way that they were just in the center of the selection. And look at the greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And so these kind of tests are being done all around the world, and more universities and researchers and NGOs are teaming up to really show the power of this of changing the defaults, whether it's with naming or placement or the way you even talk about things on a menu. It can really influence behavior in a big way, and we really need to use these levers as much as we can. So this is just a little bit of context that I wanted to share before we start a discussion with all about these topics. But I wanted everyone to have in mind how important of a role food service can have. So thank you. All right. So that was a bit of a race through, but I'm going to start with Simon, because you have such an important role to play in a big food service capacity here in Australia. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think, how powerful do you think how much power do you think food service has to really make change here with regards to putting alternative proteins and plant-based proteins on the menu?
Great question, and lots of info in there. I think, first of all, really great to remember context of countries and regions, very different regional expectations and consumer uptake, which we've kind of talked about today. From an emissions standpoint, over 98% of our emissions are related to food or the food that we purchase. 55-60% of that is animal protein. So it's a huge lever for us, but the most tricky lever of all to pull. There's lots of folks in this room that we've worked with, lots of producers, researchers, to try to change the dial, and it's really tough. Australian context of meat on plate is something that has been always there. I think someone said it, Christy said it earlier, Australians love meat, so to shift the dial is quite tricky. But how much of a role do we have? We absolutely have a huge role. We have, again, you're talking around global CSRD reporting or climate reporting. The Australian government or Treasury has thankfully passed some kind of legislation for Australia. So as of next year, we fall into tranche 1. We'll be reporting under the ASRS framework, which we've been reporting under the TCFD framework for the last nearly 5 years globally. So what that is now is that we've kind of had the carrot of all of this qualitative, we're going to do this, we're going to, do all these things, we're going to reduce emissions, whereas now there is an absolute stick coming in the back end saying that you have to reduce emissions. So part of how to get there, again, it's a bit of, I don't want to take up all the time, but up until 6-7 months ago, it was a very qualitative discussion, emissions for us, and how we're actually going to change or reduce our emissions. But we have spent a truckload of time reviewing our Scope 3, which is, again, everything we purchase. 36,000 product items in our source data have been reviewed, 180 individual points per SKU. Have been reviewed, so we can now track Scope 3 emissions live in the business to a cost centre. So again, take that information to a client and actually have a really data-led conversation with them around their impact of their choices, because it's not necessarily us bringing a menu to them. They tell us what they would actually like us to produce.
But just to follow up on that, when you show those numbers to your clients, what is the reaction?
2 years, or not even 2 years ago, 6-9 months ago, no one's really interested. Even if you talk about 4 years ago, we launched our Shift Academy, which was around how do we get more plants on plates, and we've been working down this pathway, which is still embedded in our academies now, so it's part of the curriculum we train our chefs with, of how to cook plant-based food. No one was really interested, whereas now it is, again, with the ASRS readiness program that's happening at the moment, so lots of busy consultants getting businesses ready and corporates ready for those reporting mandates. It is now, what's your emissions? Scope 1 and 2, kind of, but Scope 3. If we can give our clients absolute Scope 3 emissions, they love that. At this point, it's kind of like the YouTuber with a Ferrari, doesn't really know what to do with it yet. Now it's actually going, okay, we've got the data, how are we actually going to start pulling the levers and changing behaviours? And also the narrative of exec teams and boards and all those folks that are involved in those decision-making process.
That's really exciting. So in the last 6 months,
absolutely. It's night and day in 6 months.
David, you've done a lot of research into this kind of idea of like using defaults and changing how we train food service operators and chefs. What are some of the highlights that you've found from your research?
I definitely love the default nudge that you have shared, but obviously this is the most radical behavioral science intervention that you can run. And obviously not every food service provider is willing to change their default because they fear that it may jeopardize guest or staff satisfaction. So what we did, we started working with the Compass Group, and how we approached this whole scenario was we basically created a list of 20 interventions that we could possibly do at their sites. And then we asked the chefs, okay, which one do you think would work at your site? Which one do you think will not work? Why not? So we got the chefs on board from the get-go. And each and every one of them said, we have to put the food into the mouth of our guests. So we decided to do a sampling trial. So you can imagine it's a large all-you-can-eat buffet at 2 of their sites, and now the chefs will prepare samples of the foods that are available at the buffet and hand out the food in front of the buffet line. So this is one thing that we are currently doing, because as we have heard in the morning, taste is quite the significant barrier. Another experiment that we have done was around environmental identity, because we know that consumers don't really consider the environmental impact of the food when we make food decisions. But we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see what happens if we remind consumers that they actually care about the environment before they make their food choice? Has any one of you been to Grilled lately? Grilled, the burger store. Do you know how you get a coin after you made your purchase decision? So you go to it's a burger store, get a little coin after you make your purchase decision, and you can basically choose which charity you want to support. And what we did, we kind of flipped it, and we gave them the decision which charity they want to support before they make their food choice. And one of the charities was an environmental organization. We chose WWF. And that kind of reminded consumers, hey, I actually care about the environment, which then had an impact on their food choice. So this was done in an online experiment, and we see if we can run a field experiment with it soon.
That's really interesting. Edwin, Redefine is in, I think, over 6,000 outlets at this point with your steak and other products. And actually, you're in many steakhouses in Europe. So really love to understand more. How did you work with steakhouses to get your steak in there? And from what I understand, from speaking to some of your team, the rates of ordering for your steak versus the meat steak is actually pretty high. It's something like 1 in 10. In some of them?
Initially it was even close to 20%, some even over 20%, but then after the introduction phase of about 3 months, it went down to 10, 12, 13%. And that's more or less a stable share of the total steak sales. Yeah.
So do you use any of these techniques with how do you present it on a menu, and how did you work with the chefs or the restaurateurs, and kind of what was the reaction? And
yeah, so interesting to share, because we have a few steakhouses where we started working by implementing our steak on a menu, and the initial feedback was, okay, we'll have a vegetarian section. And we say, no, hang on, if you really want to make an impact, then you have to integrate it in the main menu. And then I said, okay, well, we'll figure out a name. I said, no. We said, no, keep the name as is, just put it on the menu as Redefine Steak. And that was actually one bridge too far for them to accept. And one specific case, Lutje, which is a very conservative steakhouse chain in the Netherlands, they said, no, we'll call it Steak 0.0 in analogy with the alcohol-free beers. And we'll see from there. And actually what we then said, but hang on, I mean, we're investing in the brand, because contrary to meat, plant-based meat is actually not homogeneous in its quality. And we invest a lot in not only product development, but also in the branding and creating this awareness. So we think there is value in making people choose a Redefine product. They didn't want to do that, so we came to an agreement to put a table talker on the table with a QR code, curious to know more about this Steak 0.0. Then they were directed to our website, where they could find all the information. And we saw from the traffic on the website, actually, that the QR code was scanned very often. And then, obviously, after the huge impact, 3 months after launch, we've reaching almost 20% of total steak sales, they suddenly realized, well, hang on, we were afraid of all those carnivores that would blame and shame us for putting plant-based steaks on the menu. But on the contrary, we've seen actually a growth of our customer base, because obviously when you have a group visiting a steakhouse, there's always 1 out of 10 that doesn't want to eat meat. And suddenly there was a meat option without any conversation at the table. What are you going to take? Instead of, the cauliflower and the salad and whatsoever. And so what happened is that they came to the insight that actually there was no longer harm in using the Redefine Meat naming on the menu, not with the logo, obviously, but they had to grow into it. And so I think sometimes you need to be creative, not too pushy. And then when the results actually demonstrate that consumers are far more open than that they would think themselves, At least that's the case in Europe. It's not necessarily the case in Australia, I don't know. But we are actually trying to find those creative solutions. But what is for sure, we have done a lot of tests, is that when you normalize it and don't put plant-based, vegan, vegetarian, but use a combination of, in our case, Redefine with a meat name. So Redefine Bœuf Bourguignon, Redefine burger, Redefine sausage, whatever. It resonates to the carnivores as something that is apparently different. They're not so sure. I mean, we're not hiding. There's maybe a vegan logo or leaf at the end of the line, but it actually makes it less embarrassing for them to make this choice, because it's all about, overcoming mental barriers. And by normalizing it as much as possible, you get the best results.
But I just want to clarify something, because on one hand, you're talking about what we call, the vegan veto, where a group will have one vegan in it, and then they won't go to a restaurant because they're going to veto it because there isn't a vegan option. So on one hand, you're saying what you're doing allows for the vegan to go to a steakhouse with their friends. Yep. But what about the meat eaters choosing your steak versus not just the vegans choosing your steak? Are you able to kind of get data on whether that's happening? And if so, why are they making that choice? Is it curiosity? Is it health? Is it just taste? They like it?
So another good example of what we've done quite recently with the Hilton Group in Europe. So we've an agreement with Hilton to list our premium burgers on the menus across all hotels. And what we did is we implemented a tool called Climato, which demonstrates actually the benefit of swapping an animal burger for a redefined burger. And
it's point of view, right?
Sorry?
From an emissions point of view,
Indeed,
they show,
so
and the water and the land.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So demonstrating the high impact that people can make, because like you've shown earlier this morning, there's several impactors on climate, and the easiest that everyone can do is changing their food choice. And this tool actually helps not only Hilton to have a positive impact on Scope 3 emissions, but also nudges the consumer to actually make a conscious choice for something that is still very meaty, but so much more beneficial for the planet.
Well, David, actually, have you done any research on kind of icons on menu items? Because I know in some of my research, I've figured out that, for example, it's not good to, as you said, Edwin, put a vegan item in a separate vegetarian and vegan section. It's better for it to be in the main menu. How have you done research on like having, a plant or having the emissions numbers? We're seeing more and more startups offering these services to restaurants and food service.
Yeah, not me personally, because the research is pretty strong in that regard, so I don't think there's more research needed at this point. So what you mentioned, we should integrate the items into the full menu because of the meat-eating identity. A lot of people identify themselves as meat eaters. So if we have a separate vegetarian section, they will not consider this particular section. And yes, definitely stay away from the V words. Yeah, so vegan, vegetarian is a big no-no, and rather use what you mentioned earlier, indulgent language. Yeah, so to bring out the flavors, maybe the local origin of the food. But yeah, definitely integrate it as much as you can. If you're afraid that vegetarians then won't find it, they will find it on the menu. Yeah. So that's nothing you need to worry about.
Yeah, go ahead. And then
one more comment, because you were asking for results, and it's a bit difficult to get very precise data in the food service channel. But we have something that is truly very interesting from an online grocery company in the UK called Ocado. We are able to measure the amount of non-users buying Redefine Meat and the amount of non-users entering the plant-based meat category. So 6 months after launch, we could demonstrate that we've recruited 10% of non-users. So just by offering something that is very meaty, that doesn't apply the standard vegan, vegetarian brand language, is talking to those carnivores, and that's how you can make an impact. And I believe it's equally important working with food service, normalizing the plant-based meat or the new meat as much as possible to bring in those non-users. Because early this morning we spoke about open omnivores and closed omnivores. This chunk of 60% is massive, and I think there are ways to open up the closed omnivores. There truly are, and we have to prove for it. But it requires a very different brand language and communication.
Absolutely. And just to follow up, David, out of all the different techniques you've studied, and you said you had 20 solutions you had looked at, what were some of the most impactful? Or that, in the sense of getting people to make the plant-based choice, other than the one you've already mentioned about reminding people about their climate commitment?
Yeah, so changing the default has the greatest effect. Anything that is related to choice architecture, so to make it basically easy to choose them, reduce the effort, because a lot of food choices are also habitual, so we need to kind of break this habit by making the plant-based choice the easy and convenient choice. And then the ones that are not that effective are kind of motivational based messages. Yeah? So if we just talk about the environment or even sometimes only promote the health benefits, that's also, it's a nice one to have, but I would focus on anything related to hedonic, so taste, focus on the taste. That's why we at Compass now hand out the free samples. So anything about the taste and making the choice just easy and convenient. Even with the price, the evidence is a little bit mixed. There were some studies done where the price of plant-based meat was reduced and it didn't have a great impact. So yeah, choice architecture is probably what I would focus on.
So easy and delicious.
Easy and delicious.
Simon, when you're talking to clients, you've been doing this a long time. What are some of the biggest challenges? Because you've talked about them pushing back.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that the majority of our business is it's not paid. So if you're a workforce, it's free to you.
Right.
You're not actually buying it. So so that's controlled by a contract manager or the committee. People love to run restaurants through contracts, so they'll generally choose their own personal choices around what they like and what they think a workforce would like. Okay. Absolutely, personal choice comes into that a lot. But I think at this point it's not been a discussion to decarbonise. It's really. I think it's interesting when you look at the two most volatile costs we have in our business are beef and dairy, yet they're still the most widely procured products in the business as well. So it's beginning to change because now we can actually have a data-led conversation saying, cool, if you want to reduce emissions, this is where your highest spend is here. If you want to, the biggest lever is to start, even just flipping beef to chicken is a game changer. So that's more the conversation we're starting to have now is actually going, how do we just focus on maybe not moving away completely from animal protein, maybe a little bit less beef, parmesan and mozzarella, and just put a little bit more chicken on the menu or other protein diversification.
But those people that you said that make the choices, and sometimes they make arbitrary choices, essentially, is what you're saying, is there a way to activate them as change makers and train them? I know you do a lot with chefs.
Yeah,
what about those people?
So the clients, yes, we're bringing them along the journey now, but it's... people just haven't seen it as a problem. I think there was that great slide this morning of where the food system sits. People just don't understand where it sits. And generally when we're working with our clients, even now with an emission discussion, we actually are kind of a drop in the ocean for a lot of those clients when you look at their emission pool as well. So they're balancing consumer satisfaction. Is their workforce happy if they change to hardline intervention of completely changing the plant forward? Is there going to be a union workforce over revolt? That would probably be 60% of our business would be governed by union workforces as well. So yeah, there's a lot of, every sector needs a different approach. I see sport and stadia as probably the largest opportunity for us in Australia at the moment. Again, it's retail.
Explain more?
Yeah, well, you've got a retail focus. So again, we're getting people to make choices and actually buy the food. But I think Christy, again, had a great slide up there previously of around the foods that you would most normally see are having, smarter proteins or alternative proteins in them. They are the most commonly sold products at a sporting event. So if you go to a sports stadium, think about the food you're eating. It's pies, hot dogs, sausage rolls, tacos, all of that type of thing, which we can easily start substituting. And if you look at what our sectors have done in North America and the UK is primarily plant-based now. You look at your largest Grand Slams around globally in tennis, Wimbledon, pretty much completely or dairy-free, and then minimal animal protein outside of chicken on their menus this year and has done for the last couple of years. So there is a big appetite for sport to actually be the vehicle to deliver sustainability.
Was there any pushback?
Very little. So the big one for Wimbledon is strawberries and cream, and that was the one thing that they kept. The cream was the dairy they kept on the menus this year and last year.
But so what I'm hearing from Simon and Edwin here is that actually there's this kind of fear of pushback, but actually the pushback tends not to be as bad. So are we just underestimating our clients and our consumers?
It depends on the sector. So it depends for us, again, it depends on the sector. So you might have a really mature client in a, I don't want to put myself in it here, but there is maturity in clients happening now, and depending on the sector that they will pull a lever. And even if it is a retail sector, you're still working with executive teams who are trying to attract folks to a game, let's call it. Is that executive team aligned with reducing animal protein? So it's a discussion and a debate that is really quite early in Australia. I think it's important for Australia to remember where we are at a sustainability standpoint. We are quite far behind from the rest of the world, but we're catching up. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom. It's just be ready for it. Yep.
Edwin, what have been some of your biggest challenges? Because we've talked about the successes, and what do you continue to have challenge with in food service? What about chefs and training them?
Yeah, I think there's two elements that remain key barriers. One is the unknown. So a lot of chefs actually have no experience yet working with plant-based meat. And they're not conscious of the fact that it's actually as convenient as working with animal meat. So there's a need for education. So one of the things that we constantly do is organize chef-to-chef events, where ambassador chefs and other partner chefs actually demonstrate and inspire chefs what they can do with our meat, and demonstrate how easy our products are to cook with. But also, exchanging on product naming, recipe development, and all those things. So inspiration and education is still a big task ahead of us, but it's working. And the second barrier, I would say, is still price, in the sense that the chefs face so many challenges in terms of staffing and the cost of living, that they tend to push back on price. Now, there's two elements. One is that if we want consumers to make a conscious choice, we should not put up the price barrier. So on the menu, any plant-based option should be positioned at exactly the same price as the animal version. If you differentiate, you're going to slow down the transition. That's a given. And the second is actually that we need to make sure that chefs understand that the level of satiety of our products is higher than of animal meat. So you need actually less weight to put in a dish. And that allows you actually, even if there were a price gap between a plant-based meat option and an animal meat, you can adjust. And ultimately, what we need is scaling. So, and meat prices going up, so we reach price parity. A step further would be to stop all the subsidies, which is a very unfair competition. Just to give you an example of the Netherlands, the whole meat industry receives 870 million euros of subsidies per year, and the plant-based meat industry gets 17. That's a little pot of innovation. It's ridiculous. So we have to change all those things. But starting with chefs, educate them, and make them understand that actually it does work in a P&L of a dish, and to put it on the same price level as any animal version.
Can I also just throw in there as well? I think when you look at the scope of work that we do, let's just say the industrial traditional canteen with the buffet servery, what we're missing here in Australia is also primal cuts. So there's only so much mince and burgers and schnitzels and sausages that you can put on, and most, if I generalise, most scopes would be 5 choices. You would have a wet dish, so perfect choice, but have we got the right product to go in there? And will that scope of that allow us to do that? And then you would have 3 roast products generally, and then a grill to order. So that would be on average what we would do on a 5-choice menu. And what is there in a primal cut that we can use at the moment that's plant-based? So it is another
there is a
barrier.
gap there.
Absolutely, absolutely, there's a barrier. Yep.
Great.
David, from what I understand, you've done a lot of research about plant-based curriculums in culinary schools. What have you uncovered in your research, and what can be done to change?
Yes, I absolutely love this study. So we started with basically interviewing chefs, asking them what they think about alternative proteins and why they may not offer them. And there were all sorts of barriers. Some were very similar to the consumer barriers that what we see in terms of they just think that they don't taste that great. Other very interesting barriers and very unique to the chefs is they just think they are boring to cook with, and they feel like they are being looked down upon because chefs are very proud people who want to be proud of what they are serving. So they see it, it's a cutout. So they can't really put their identity in the dish. So familiarity, taste, environmentally unfriendly, not available, cost. And what some of the chefs said were, if I was educated on them, perhaps then I would consider. That led us to basically we developed the hypothesis that people who are formally trained, so in culinary schools or informally, through all different ways chefs learn after their culinary training, either attending workshops, talking to colleagues, watching TV shows, whatever it might be. Our hypothesis was that more education is associated with lower perceived barriers. So we did a follow-up study to test that, and it was confirmed. But the formal education, it wasn't really surprising, but it scored very low. So chefs haven't really learned anything about plant-based meat in culinary schools. And then we basically reviewed all the available curricula in Australia, and not a single one mentioned it. The best, what we could see, was plant-based food or vegan cooking under dietary requirements. So it's not even its category itself, which we then realized, okay, we really have to start at the beginning with culinary schools or re-educating chefs, because once we train them and teach them, hey, it's actually fun to cook with them, you can create delicious dishes with them, and once you put them on the menu, consumers will also order them. That this is a great leverage point for us.
There's still a lot more. What about using? So we saw a video earlier in a tasting session of Edwin's company, Redefine Meat, with the very famous chef Marco Pierre White. How important do you think it is for these kind of Michelin level kind of culinary superstars to be endorsing and promoting plant-based meat companies? Do you think that would move the lever more?
It's a good question. So that will be something I have to look at, because I don't have any evidence for how chefs are being influenced. So it's a question for the chefs. And if we find out that they are influenced by Michelin star chefs, then it obviously would be a great idea to incorporate them. But I don't know at this point if that's
something to look into. I mean, there's very few at the moment. I don't know how many Michelin chefs are endorsing, but definitely a good way for them to become change makers. Out of all the research that you did with chefs and kind of looking at education, what was the most surprising thing about your research?
I think
from chefs.
I think it's just that we talked with them about environmental sustainability, and not a single chef mentioned a reduction of meat as a way to reduce the environmental footprint of the restaurant. I mean, it's somewhat surprising, that because we obviously know from the consumer research that there is this gap, but that it's also so existent in the restaurant environment, and from the chefs, I think that was somewhat surprising to me that there was just no education from the culinary schools towards that.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think just through some of the work we've done over the last couple of years, that there is a lot of, there's probably 2 or 3 main industry advocacy bodies in Australia when it comes to agricultural production, and they are the influencing folks over the education curriculum in most of the TAFE institutions in Australia. And it's all about putting more meat on plate. And sustainability means, I guess, it's more about they don't tie it into planet. So when you start talking about emissions and so forth with those advocacy bodies, it's not really an area they like to talk about. So that would be my feedback on culinary education.
Okay, well, we've got a few minutes left, and we've got a fair few audience questions. So I'm gonna give them one of you take one question. Otherwise, we're going to be here too long. Actually, quickly for Redefine Meat, why is your product not in Australia yet, Edwin?
Oh gosh, because I didn't pass the customs. Yeah, that's frustrating. No, listen, the question.
Like the commercial launch.
Yeah, no, of
Any
course,
plans
no.
to list
Yeah,
in
no,
Australia?
definitely. I mean, when I was approached to join the conference, obviously I was delighted to learn more about the state of the industry in Australia. But I mean, for me, it's not so much a question of whether we will enter the Australian market, but more when and how. So I take this opportunity to learn more about the market, and will definitely come, and it won't take long, I believe.
Okay, so stay tuned. One question is around the response of religious certification bodies. So for example, halal certification and kosher certification to the kind of alternative proteins and foods we're discussing today. I don't know which of you would be best placed on this, but does that come up at all in the research?
Yeah.
The kind of the overview between the
Yeah, well, actually, we have kosher and halal certification, and it is important because, among others, in Muslim communities, halal is definitely very critical. So we use it just to make it more inclusive.
I learned a very, very fascinating statistic the other day. Please fact check me, but somebody very reputable told me that 1 in 3 people will be Muslim in 2050. So if that is true, then the halal certification is going to be a major, it's going to be just absolutely key for anything to do with meat.
I think when it comes to plant proteins, it's allergen management for us. So allergen management is a critical risk or a fatal risk in our business. And that is, there's definitely anecdotal hesitance around incorporating processed plant protein on menus around allergens.
Okay. We do have a question specifically for you around Scope 3 emissions. How do you get the numbers for the Scope 3 emissions that you mentioned?
Great question. So we, depends how technical, how long we got, 2 minutes. So we use a company called Planet Forward out of North America. They look after the top 3 regions for Compass Group globally. So they're taking our emissions to a regional level. So we're not using US or European emissions. And then they're taking them as far down to a geographical level as they can with readily available databases that are in Australia. A lot of this is free to anyone to read, highly boring and not interesting. But these folks have a great way of actually collating all that data. But the conversations that we're starting to have with mature clients is around how do we get product level LCAs from them, because that we can then plug that straight into our system, and we can have drive some really great accuracies, and we're seeing about a 20% reduction on average for products where we've got actual LCAs from the manufacturer.
Okay, we did have a question about the tool used to show the difference in emissions. The tool that Edwin referred to was Klimato with a K. I believe they're a Swedish company.
There's also a company in Australia called Calix that does the same thing as well, very similar.
There are many fantastic tools, some adapted more to retail, some adapted more to restaurants. We have 2 different questions about the word protein. I'm going to give this to you, David. Very interesting. So one question is, do you think buzzwords like high protein drive interest in food service over plant-based? And then we have another one that says, should we consider changing the training from meat cookery to protein cookery in training packages? So I'm grouping these together because of the word protein, which
Yeah,
two different ways to look
I
at
think we have to collectively make a decision how we tackle the wording of protein, because obviously, especially in developed countries, there's the famous quote that not a lot of people get hospitalized because of lack of protein, but because of lack of fiber. So I think together we have to decide if we want to reinforce this obsession about protein that was created in the last century. Obviously, protein is quite important, but maybe we want to shift the conversation more towards fiber, for example. But yes, I think the overall calling it protein, including animal and plant-derived in culinary schools, for example, would be, I think that would be a great starting point.
But just quick follow-up, did you look at the plant-based curriculums in culinary schools around the world?
We looked at the culinary curriculums in Australia.
And how many of them had plant-based or kind of reducing meat and plant-based meat as part
No,
of
not a single one had that as the curriculum. There were some who mentioned kind of vegan cooking as part of their dietary requirement cooking, so gluten-free cooking or vegan cooking.
So like an allergen thing or like more
Yes,
like a,
yes.
rather than any kind of environmental.
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, all three of you. It's been really fascinating. And yeah, hopefully everyone can follow up with you later.